Okay, everybody, good morning. Can I welcome you all to the 17th meeting of 2025 of the Economy and the Fair Work Committee. Our first item of business is a decision to take item number 3, consideration of evidence in private. Are members content to take this item in private? Thank you very much indeed. Our next item of business is an evidence session on regional inequalities and productivity in Scotland. This morning's evidence session is part of the committee's ongoing consideration of the Scottish Government's National Strategy for Economic Transformation, where productivity is a key element. I'm delighted to welcome our panel this morning, David Phillips, Associate Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Simon Pittaway, Senior Economist at the Resolution Foundation, and also Professor Bridget Wessels, Professor in Sociology of Inequalities at the Productivity Institute. Thank you so much to our panel for joining us this morning. As always, an appeal to members and witnesses to keep questions and answers as concise as possible. Can I kick off with the first question to our panel? I suppose the regional inequalities in relation to earnings and productivity performance across Scotland are very well documented. I'm based down in Dumfries and Galloway. We have usually the lowest wages, lowest earnings in Scotland, a substantial difference between the centre of Edinburgh and rural communities in Dumfries and Galloway. I'm just keen to kick off the session by asking the panel's views on what drives that regional equality that we see across Scotland, and how do, I suppose, sectors compare in different parts of the country. A nice straightforward question to kick off. I don't know who wishes to go first. The first person I can see is Professor Wessels on the screen, so we'll kick off with yourself.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I think it's a great question. And I think it is to do with sector. It's to do with kind of the value of those sectors. But I think I do quite a lot of work in Dumfries and Galloway, and you have got mainly agribusiness. That agribusiness is diversifying, so there's lots of opportunities. But it's actually then bringing in the investment and the skills into that place in order to, if you like, realise that potential. Where you've got somewhere like Edinburgh, very well established, you've got universities coming through, you've got your skills pipeline, and also they're very well placed, they're much better connected internationally and understand the investment landscape much, much more. So I think going forward, the ways in which the economy is having to adapt and develop resilience, it's about understanding the potential that is in places like Dumfries and Galloway, but kind of what kind of infrastructure and how can those sectors actually get investment and be able to draw out the maximum productivity for growth in those particular places.
Is it about growing those sectors that have maybe historically low wages, or is it about actually attracting new sectors into that area?
I think it's both. I think there's something really interesting working with businesses in that area, but also actually farmers. When you look at examples, case studies of farmers, there's one farmer whose farm wasn't doing very well and really diversified, but also invested in green tech. And actually, in looking at how to use waste, I mean, it sounds very how he could use his waste in much more productive ways. Not only has he improved the yield of his farm, but he's also diversifies into holidays, tourism, and so on. So I think it's about enabling some of those existing sectors to realise the potential within those areas. It's not going to make it's not we're going to go from, being a farm to being a sort of a specialised health international expert, but it's about realising that potential. So I think it's a bit of both. I think there's also really a real key thing in Dumfries and Galloway in particular about inward investment, about getting inward migration to get people to move to Dumfries and Galloway in order to foster the skills and grow the economy.
Okay, thanks very much. Next on my screen is David, so I'll bring David in now. Same question to yourself, David.
Good morning, Kavina. Good morning, committee. So yes, I think if you look at the factors underlying differences in productivity across places, not just within Scotland, but across the UK as a whole, and actually kind of across throughout the world, it's a combination of two factors which kind of self-reinforce. It's the composition of the workforce, with concentrations of higher skilled, very highly skilled people, increasingly so in major cities, and then also the sort of concentration of high-paid jobs in those cities as well. And you have then, to some extent, if you like, a little bit of a sort of a chicken and egg situation. You know, high-skilled firms will go where the high-skilled people are. High-skilled people will move to some extent where those high-skilled jobs are. What you see actually in terms of wages is actually the sort of bottom sort of third of the sort of wage distribution that's fairly similar across places. It's really that kind of like top third, really, and particularly the top 20%, which looks very different. It's that kind of concentration of very highly paid jobs in the cities, which sort of brings up the average earnings, the average productivity. Now, what we've actually seen in Scotland, Scotland does a relatively good job compared to most other areas outside of London in retaining graduates and high-skilled within Scotland. And you particularly see that with Edinburgh, but also to a lesser extent Glasgow, and historically at least Aberdeen. Scotland's rural areas also do reasonably well economically compared to other rural areas in the UK, certainly in terms of earnings. I haven't got the exact figures to hand, but when I looked at this a couple of years ago, you know, even though Scotland has, you know, a large share of the sort of most rural areas of the country, very few of the sort of lowest productivity areas, such as like Cornwall or Lincolnshire, the sort of most rural areas of England, and then some areas rural in Scotland, unfortunately not so much Dumfries and Galloway, but places like Stirlingshire, Perthshire, they actually score really quite well in terms of earnings compared to other more rural areas. And the last thing I sort of say here as well is that I think when it comes to thinking about sort of an economic strategy for Scotland and its regions, what we need to kind of avoid is thinking that each area needs to be a high-tech, super high productivity area. There's evidence that basically agglomeration effects, kind of like clustering effects, do matter for the generation, particularly of certain like knowledge-based industries. And maybe what one needs to look at is sort of, you know, the sort of a few key high-tech hubs, and then making sure that there's sort of access to those hubs for people across Scotland, or making sure that housing is available in them, and there's market access to those from other parts of Scotland, and then in the rest of Scotland, making sure that the comparative advantages of those areas are supported. So I would sort of echo what Professor Wessels was saying, that it's important not to think that, well, the success for Dumfries and Galloway is just to make it a bit more like Edinburgh in terms of an economic mix. It's about actually ensuring people in Dumfries and Galloway can access opportunities in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh, but also that businesses in Dumfries and Galloway have their own support, which is tailored to them.
Thanks very much for that, David. A really interesting point there about the way average earnings maybe don't always reflect, I suppose, the lowest earnings, those at the top. That's quite an interesting point. Can I bring in our final panel member, Simon? Same question to yourself, Simon.
Thanks. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Just picking up on a couple of things that the other panellists have said. So I think David's point about having a sense of realism about what levelling regional inequalities might look like is a really important one. And we did at the Resolution Foundation, we did a big piece of work in recent years looking at industrial strategy for the UK as a whole. And as part of that, we did some in-depth qualitative work in Yorkshire, talking to people about what a levelled up Yorkshire might look like for them. And what came out of that was this sense of realism about not every place needs to be the same, and you know, some level of difference in the opportunities available between regions is something that people are perfectly comfortable with. They just want to feel like they are somehow connected to these opportunities. So, you know, transport links and infrastructure being a big part of that, and B, just having a sense of pride in their local area, even if it's not a superstar tech city of the future. So I thought that was a really well made point by David. And then, yeah, I think on the drivers, I agree that the composition of the workforce and the location of particularly high-skilled, high-paid jobs is very important. But it doesn't always map through to, well, there's something to be said about what inequalities are you trying to address. So productivity is a measure of, it's a very important measure of economic output, and it does correlate pretty well with living standards over the long term. But when you talk about regional levels, some of that productivity doesn't necessarily accrue to workers. It goes to firms. And so, the owners of firms in certain regions might not be based in those regions themselves. So if you're raising productivity in a way that doesn't accrue to workers, then that might not be reducing some of the income gaps that you might be more concerned about when thinking about regional inequalities.
Thanks very much for that. Can I bring in Lorna Slater with a follow-up question on that issue?
Thank you, Convener. I'm going to continue on that same theme. Certainly, the financial press and so on bemoan Western democracies' lack of productivity growth. So it would be useful for me if you can frame that for us a bit. Is improving productivity possible? Is it desirable? Does anyone know how to do it? Because it seems like everybody's struggling. And is that really what we need to transform our economy and make it less unequal?
So, are we doing the same round as before? I'll kick off again. I think, yes, it is. Certainly at the Productivity Institute, which is a UK-wide ESRC-funded institute looking at productivity, the way in which we've defined it, we've widened it out away just from input to output. Yes, that's really important. But if we become more productive, then we've got more money to develop kind of public services, but also we're giving people aspiration and talent and taking them into the workplace where they can actually realise and develop. So if we think of work not just as a transaction, but if we think of fair work and good work as part of the ways in which people develop, it's creating those opportunities. It's also ensuring that place-based activity, there's a sense of if you've got growth and opportunities within place, then actually that enables those sort of places to grow and flourish. So there is, I think, the productivity puzzle is very difficult, but I think it's difficult because the ways in which new sort of technologies coming down the line, new kind of supply chains, new markets are evolving all the time. And there's always a lag between sort of the innovation of new technologies, the innovation of new markets and development of new markets, and the ways in which countries can actually adapt in order to harness those opportunities for its population. And I think even though Scotland's actually doing quite well, in a sense, looking at our productivity insight paper of 2025, we compared Scotland with with Wales and Northern Ireland as well as England, and it is doing well. And I think the size of Scotland is really quite useful, and the diversity of the economy is really useful in fostering that. And I think things like initiatives like Fair Work, community wealth building and so on is a really good platform in order to build inclusive growth. So I think it's thinking about productivity in relation to inclusive growth. And it's very difficult to do, but that kind of partnership approach, kind of at regional level and the national level, and understanding the relationship between the two is really, really important. I think one of the challenges for Scotland is that there's lots and lots of strategies, and it's how do you move from the strategies to implementation, I think is a key question.
So if I come in now as well, I think kind of, I agree with a lot with Professor Wessel says there. I think productivity isn't the be-all and end-all, but I think it is an important factor. I think kind of perhaps where your question's coming from as well is to distinguish between productivity and growth. If you actually think that growth isn't necessarily an answer, well, you can actually have higher productivity and then take some of that in the benefit of extra leisure time, not necessarily kind of, continue to work as much and get more output. So I think you can, even if you're someone who doesn't believe growth is sort of the answer to kind of issues, extra productivity still is probably a good thing to have. Now, when it comes to sort of factors that can affect productivity and, how easy they're to change. I think, there is quite good evidence about the factors that affect productivity, sort of in a descriptive sense. We know that skills matter. We know that business investment matters. One of the things we increasingly know is that management skill matters. And the UK traditionally looks pretty poor when it comes to management skills, certainly compared to, say, US and Germany and France and so on. What actually works in improving those things, that is a bit less clear. And I think what you need to do there is you need to be kind of, constantly evaluating what you're doing and learning lessons from other countries. So kind of like doing international case studies and reviewing your performance. I think it is quite clear that sort of efforts to improve the intermediate level of skills in the UK probably would pay dividends. I think we kind of tend to focus a lot on kind of universities and a bit less on those intermediate skills. I think also another focus should be not just on private sector productivity, but public sector productivity, where we've seen the biggest reductions in or the worst performance in productivity in recent years, unfortunately, has been in the public sector, where there's been quite a big increase in staffing numbers in large parts of the public sector, but you haven't seen that increase, say, for example, in the number of operations or treatments or other things coming through in the NHS, and has been unfortunately dragging down overall productivity growth. And actually, just to come back to kind of what productivity growth might mean for the kind of future of kind of the state and its ability to kind of fund services and redistribute. Well, historically, what we tended to see is productivity growth in the public sector, not just in the recent years, but in a longer-term time frame, somewhat lag behind that in the private sector. Now, that's, I think, in general, just about the public sector. It's the kind of activities the public sector does, labour-intensive activities like healthcare and social care and education. Those, because it's not so easy to automate aspects of those as it is, say, in many other sectors, those have not had such high productivity growth. That's mean that their relative cost has increased, which is one of the factors underlying kind of an increase in the sort of public spending as a share of national income and hence tax as a share of national income. So the reason I mentioned that is that looking forwards, given what we know about an ageing population, given what we know about all the pressures in the public sector, I think a key focus of any productivity strategy needs to be the public sector as well as the private sector to make sure that, or to help slow down the sort of looming fiscal crisis affecting both Scotland and the rest of the UK. So if there's one thing that's missing a little bit in this strategy, well, there's a couple of things missing in the NSET, but one thing that was a notable absence is the public sector, which is a large part of the economy and a part that has historically, for many good reasons, had relatively weak productivity growth, but new technologies might actually help address some of that.
If I can come in on this as well. David's absolutely right to highlight the role of the public sector and specifically the health sector over the past 5 years or so. It's worth remembering that there's lots of measurement issues in productivity, and those are particularly acute when it comes to health, and the headline numbers that feed into GDP aren't necessarily taking full account of quality improvements, but I did a bit of research on this recently, and even if you account for those productivity improvements, which NHS England have published some numbers on that, and the ONS themselves have their own series as well, it's still the health sector is still dragging down on productivity growth at the moment. So it's right that should be an area of focus. I was just going to say on productivity growth and whether this is a kind of something to be aiming for. It's definitely right that it's not the be all and end all. But it's worth noting there are a lot of positive spillovers to the things that you might do to boost productivity growth. So again, going back to the health sector, boosting health sector productivity, it's good if you want to boost productivity, but it's also good for people's quality of life if they get treated quicker and better quality health outcomes. Upskilling the workforce means more education for people, particularly, as David says, post high school. And if you ask people who have engaged in further education, they are generally very positive about their experience. And capital as well, more investment can mean just giving people and workers more kit to do their jobs with, and that might take away some of the more onerous time-consuming bits of their job that they might find less satisfying, and give them more time to do their more high-skilled, engaging bits of their job. So even if productivity isn't your end goal, lots of things you might do to boost productivity have these various positive spillover effects elsewhere.
Thank you very much. I've got one just quick supplemental, which not everyone will want to come in on. It's an observed regional inequality. I was I travelled to Orkney over the Easter recess, and I passed through Wick and then to Kirkwall. And the difference between Wick, Thurso was, boarded up shop fronts, to Kirkwall with the sort of its thriving shops and so on. And I asked one of the councillors in Kirkwall about that. And one of the things that he said, again, this is an anecdote and I'd be interested in your thoughts on it, is because such a large proportion of the economy in Orkney is public sector, is the council and so on, they are able to maintain a sort of higher, I guess, quality of life and so on than Thurso, which has lacked the sort of similar investment. So for all the public sector may be inefficient and lacking productivity, it is a tool that I've anecdotally seen that can be used to manage regional inequality and regional economic success. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, go on, David, and then I'll follow.
Yeah, so I've got kind of a couple of thoughts there. So firstly, I think you're right, both in terms, so I think the public sector is important economically for two reasons. One is just pure redistribution, as you kind of highlight there. The local government finance system, or even the sort of like funding system for different regions and nations of the UK, is redistributive. So I think in particular in Scotland, the islands do get a relatively sort of high share of funding, in part to reflect the kind of like extra needs that come from them. I think the islands in recent years have been particularly good also at winning some additional funding, which might have an impact there. So yes, the public sector is important to a redistribution and does a lot to kind of hold up incomes in those areas with lower productivity, fewer job opportunities, both through public consumption spending and through like the benefit system. The second thing I think is that the public sector and what it does is really important in terms of actually giving opportunities to people right across Scotland to access those best jobs. So, for example, I think we shouldn't forget the role of the education system, the health system, the social care system, which are particularly important in those areas where perhaps you don't have those superstar firms with the highest productivity, both because they provide, some good quality jobs in the local area, but also they provide opportunities for people in that local area to build the skills. And then if that does mean moving a little bit down the road, but they can still do that to access those high skilled jobs. So the public sector, whilst it has been, recent years, I said, the NHS in particular, we do need to look at productivity there. We shouldn't say it's a basket case. It does do a lot of good in terms of supporting economies and supporting opportunity. There's scope to do better.
I think it's a great point in terms of the intra-regional dynamics. So I think you can look at different regions or different places, and it's getting that mixed economy to build resilience within particular places. And I think that does need that mixed economy. Public sector is part of that. And I think there is, again, innovation in the public sector, the rolling out of telehealth. I think in Dumfries and Galloway, to go back to the original, there's work being done at the Crichton Trust, which is almost in wealth building a community anchor organisation, which is really developing the care campus. It's well known. They're actually undertaking world-leading research in terms of using robotics in care. They're bringing the health sector through that. But I think that intra-regional dynamics and having that local economy with that mixed economy is absolutely vital in terms of bringing people through for jobs, for sustainable growth. I think we talk about growth, but let's talk about sustainable growth. And I think building capacity and capability in those places. And when we think of the rise of the space tech in the islands, for example, people are beginning to see new opportunities in these places. But in order for those places to benefit, it's having those skills and having that capacity within those places that can sort of feed into the local economy and improve the lives of local people, and then not having to kind of sort of farm in people from elsewhere. So years and years ago, Leeds in England they developed what they called a dual economy. It grew, but they didn't have the skills and the capacity and capability within the lead city. So it attracted external people. And then you got the left behind population, and you got the small inner sort of financial people doing quite well. And that actually divided the city. And you had areas that were doing quite wealthy, were being gentrified, and then the surrounding areas were being left behind. So I think in terms of that inclusive growth and participation in the economy, I think looking at the intra-regional dynamics is really important. It's a great point.
Thanks very much for that. Can I bring in Jamie on a supplementary question on that issue?
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. I'll maybe ask questions about digitalisation a little bit later, but I just wanted to ask about the public sector side of it, just to follow up what you've been talking about. I mean, everybody will have experienced, for example, roadworks that seem to take a lot longer than they need to take, and there doesn't seem any great demand to get them finished. Looking at the health sector, I was trying to book patient transport for a family member. It took 6 calls, and then I was told at the end of that I had to ring directly 25 minutes, 30 minutes on the phone to somebody else for booking something that in the private sector I could have probably booked online in a matter of minutes. And, you know, we see that again and again across the health service and councils and other parts of the public sector. Bearing in mind that there are, as you suggested, some good examples as well, do you think there is enough demand or desire within the public sector to move more quickly to kind of improve productivity, both for the people that work within the sector, but also those who have to engage with it?
I think because you've got your public sector reform agenda. I was at that summit, I think about a month ago or 6 weeks ago, and I think that what drives the public sector is actually there's a public service ethos there still. I think the hard challenge is that sort of organisational change. And we talked a lot about shared services, for example. Now, years and years ago, when I was down working in London, it was just as the digital internet, it was just as the web was mainstreaming. So it was looking at how can you bring together the different develop partnership approaches and join up services to improve public sector delivery. And even then, and I think it's still difficult now, you've got different systems, different operating systems, and you've got different priorities, and also the way the finance flows as well is really important. So I think there is a kind of, a willingness definitely to change. I think the difficulty is how to change, because there's a lot of sort of, if you like, challenges to that and understanding that holistically. I think there's also concern. I did quite a lot of work around mainstreaming telehealth. And yes, telehealth was seen as having real positives, but there was a concern at the kind of community health level was that those teams were wanting to work proactively, but the ways in which telehealth was working was meant that it had to be more reactive because the data coming through wasn't quite reliable. So I think there's an underlying piece of work where there needs to be confidence in moving over to something that is more joined up. And then, of course, you've also got the kind of accountability, health in particular, where is that accountability and how can that be shown through? So I think there is a willingness, but I think there's real key challenges, and I think working on that's really important.
I think that's very interesting. I was at Inverness Prison recently, and they were having to do prisoner transfers all by hand because the court system doesn't link in with theirs. So that was interesting. I don't know if Simon and David want to cover anything on that as well quickly.
I was just going to say briefly, I think, some of the problems with public sector productivity, in my view, are kind of downstream of a system that's operating at beyond its effective capacity. And some of the responses to that. So in the health sector, for example, what's happened, what we've seen is kind of protection of frontline staff and services, and that's really good. But also the counterpart to that has been a reduction in NHS management capacity, and that can work for a while, But those problems of, and as David alluded to before, we know that management is very important across the economy for productivity. But if you have a consistent erosion of an organisation's management capacity, at some point that's going to start flaring up with, inefficient practices cropping up here and there, like the one you mentioned with booking transport. So, yeah, I think the kind of funding level and the funding mix is definitely something to be looked at there in terms of public sector productivity.
And just very quickly to follow on from what Simon was saying there, I think you do notice this quite often, kind of a tendency to say, well, cut the management and we'll invest in the front line, which is a good soundbite, but it's not necessarily what's always best for delivery of services. Of course, you want to kind of cut out unnecessary bureaucracy, unnecessary management, streamline things where you can, but management is a key function. And if you actually compare the health sector in the UK with other health sectors around the world, we have a smaller share of administrative and management support than most of the health services. And what we've seen over the last few years, at least, is like a big increase in clinical staff that hasn't been matched by an increase in kind of support staff. So perhaps they're having to do more of the admin themselves. And of course, it's not kind of making use of the doctors or the nurses' best skills if they're doing some of those administrative tasks that someone else can more specialise in. The last thing I'd say on this is that I think that, last two things. The first thing is I think for a while there was a little bit of a resistance to this idea that there was a productivity problem in the NHS, in particular post-pandemic. We had to kind of bang on that door a fair while with the NHS kind of pushing back. I think once you've accepted the problem, that's the first stage to addressing one. I do think that now is a bit of an acceptance that there has been a bit of a sort of an unfortunate downward shift in productivity, and there's a bit of a focus on sort of addressing that. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that I do think there's an acceptance and there's sort of a desire to kind of improve productivity and improve outcomes. Because I think the way they would see it is less as productivity, but improving outcomes for the kind of people that they're serving. I do think, though, that change can be difficult as well. And I think what we might see in the future is as you apply new technologies, it will create new opportunities for workers in some areas, it will create better services in some areas, but unfortunately it probably will mean that some of the roles that are traditionally there are less required. And I think kind of the public sector does sometimes struggle to kind of like adapt to kind of changes given the quite sort of hierarchical and structured nature of the kind of workforce. So I think one of the challenges going forwards will be actually when we kind of think about kind of the role of technology, whether it's improving diagnostics or improving administration, or actually is there the flexibility in kind of like workforce planning and kind of work stream planning to deal with that? I think that'll be a big challenge going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much for that. Can I bring in Gordon MacDonald?
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. I want to widen out the discussion about productivity levels away from the public sector. So there are a number of underlying factors that influence productivity levels. So I'm keen to understand what is it that Scotland does well and what is it where Scotland has a challenge. I'm aware that Scotland's productivity over the last 15 years has grown at a faster rate than the UK as a whole. Scotland's in the third highest ONS ranking out of the 12 regions for productivity, but it still is 2% below the UK average, which is substantially better than Northern Ireland, which is 13% under, and Wales, which is 17% under. But what are the factors that influence productivity levels? What are we doing well, and where are the challenges?
So, great question, and it's really good to recognise where Scotland is doing as well as its challenges. I think it has advantages in terms of its higher education. So I think in terms and its level of education within the workforce, it's also really good. It's sort of key. It's got its top 100 businesses are very, very good. It's got key strengths in advanced manufacturing, in space, in specialised medicine. So it's got really key areas where it leads. It's world leading. I think the challenges are that we've sort of found. The challenges are, first of all, the inequality of skilled across the different regions. So Edinburgh, as we know, does very well, but Glasgow, just down the road, doesn't do as well. So you've got that sort of mix of skill sets and, if you like, skill pathways, or those innovation in particular places in fostering those skill pathways. I think health and health inequalities is an issue that Scotland faces. It has quite a number of sort of inactivity due to kind of health. And it's also tended to, in the last few years, invest concentrated sort of employment trends in low-value service sectors. So I think the challenge is how to actually grow, if you like, advanced manufacturing and the digital tech. And it's got centres of excellence. It's, I think, really that pathways coming through. And it has, you know, its skills pathways are coming through, its education is there. But I think it's bringing that through into the workplace. I think there's also an issue around investment. I think investment in certain sectors, particularly women in business, for example, there are less investment. And I think an issue is there's quite a number of startups in Scotland. What we found is it's the scaling up. So once businesses reach a certain level, it's the support and investment for scaling up, which I think is really sort of important. And then often what we find is that the businesses that do really well sell and they sell internationally, so we're not keeping that capacity and value within Scotland. I could go on some more, but I think hopefully that's addressed some of those issues.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just on that last point you raised about scaling up, you said that a lot of companies, startups, are sold possibly to help the growth of the company. So, I mean, how much influence is there? We've seen a lot of loss of HQs in Scotland. We lost our stock exchange in the early 1970s. How much of these are a factor in companies being forced to sell because they're struggling to raise finance?
I think I can't answer that in a clear yes or no, but certainly in the work that we've done with companies, certainly the Scottish Investment Bank, Scottish Enterprise, there's a lot of work being done around sort of ensuring that people are aware of the new opportunities for investment. So I think there has been a drop-off, but I think there's now other organisations coming in to foster that investment. And a lot of that's also focusing on triple bottom line, that kind of approach, which aligns well with other aspects that are happening, with the ways in which firms are developing. So some of our most successful firms, particularly, you know, like, let's give an example, ACS, I feel I'm giving examples, but I think that's quite useful, around the circular economy, that hit a real financial sort of pressure point. It didn't realise it had gone down the circular economy mode. That encouraged investment at a really good level of return, and they've really grown. So I think I can't answer your particular question whether that was the issue, but certainly new kinds of investment need to be coming through, and companies need to be more aware of it. And it's beginning to happen, but it's slow.
Okay. David?
Yeah, so on the kind of first question you had there, I think there's a number of factors why Scotland's doing well. I think kind of skills, as Professor Wessels was saying, there has been important, particularly kind of higher education. I think there is a question about whether that is being sustained. We have seen some degradation in recent years in terms of how Scotland looks like it's performing, both in terms of its PISA scores, but actually also in terms of progression to higher education amongst those with low SES backgrounds, which in recent years has gone up by quite a bit more in England than it has in Scotland, although it's a bit complicated in Scotland because of the sort of different routes you get into higher education. I think also the kind of diversified mix of compared to, say, Wales, it was never historically as concentrated in sort of one industry or a few industries, and I think that has had benefits sort of in the long term. It had a diversified economy to start with, and that's helped it maintain and expand upon that. And I think you do have sort of agglomerations in particular areas. So historically, there's a kind of agglomeration of finance in Edinburgh, an agglomeration of sort of energy in Aberdeen. There was sort of agglomeration of sort of high-tech stuff just to the sort of west of Edinburgh. And Glasgow actually has been improving its position over time somewhat. It still lags Edinburgh, but actually there's been a bit of a narrowing of the gap between Glasgow and Edinburgh over time. And you actually see that if you go to the two cities, you know, and compare that to, say, going to them 20 years ago. I think the other thing that is sort of noticeable in Scotland, said, is that I mentioned this earlier, its rural areas just do reasonably well compared to other rural areas in the UK. And I must say, I don't know why that is. Is it because of the sort of, you know, they are having somewhat sort of more urban activities also in them, so they don't look as rural in terms of economic makeup? Or is it because they have high-value rural-type businesses, you know, for example, whiskey or sort of, you know, agro-tourism or things like that? I'm not so sure, but looking at the kind of success of rural areas, I think if I was in the rest of the UK, I'd be saying, look at Scotland for its rural areas. Maybe within Scotland, there's scope for some areas that are rural and not doing quite as well. So, for example, Argyll and Bute and the south of Scotland, to look at what's happening in kind of the central and northern Scotland rural areas.
So one of the things I was wanting to ask you was in relation to productivity. How important is population growth?
So I don't think population growth per se is important at all. I think particular kinds of population growth and decline can be important. If you're seeing kind of an in-move of people that are highly skilled, that can be complementary to high-skilled employers, that can help boost productivity. Some of that is, if you like, artificial in the sense that it's sort of, you know, well, you just get new people coming in. It's not, you know, necessarily supporting the local population. In areas where you have population growth, newcomers coming in, and you're not getting the housing development, and all that's happening then is housing prices are going up, that tends to actually hurt the existing local population. There's research from America which suggests that actually if you're a low-paid person in one of these superstar cities like San Francisco, your living standards are actually worse than if you were in kind of one of the cheaper areas. So if you're not actually building housing, you know, this kind of incoming high-skilled jobs which boosts the aggregate productivity can actually be bad for you. So I think what you need to make sure is that whatever your strategy is, whether that is to kind of bring in some new high-tech jobs, new skilled workers, that you complement that with sort of complementary infrastructure, particularly housing, so that existing people's budgets are not squeezed by kind of rents going up. And of course, you then get a bit of a two-tier effect, right? And you see this where if you're a homeowner in that area, even if you're quite low paid, you still gain, and then you sell up and you move out. And it's those trapped in rental accommodation, particularly in the private sector, the ones that lose out if you don't build housing to go alongside economic growth.
Okay. Thank you. Simon, same questions?
Yeah, so I think Professor Wessels and David have covered off loads of bits. I think I'll just say a little bit about the cities as being a strength of Scotland. So David mentioned the rural areas, but you know, Edinburgh and Glasgow, if you compare them to basically any other city in the UK, you know, medium-sized city, apart from London, they do really well. That's like a key strength for Scotland. And in terms of why that is the case, you know, we've alluded to kind of historic strength, particularly in Edinburgh, finance in Edinburgh, that putting the city in a particularly good position to take advantage of the transition to a services-led economy and the kind of build-out of the financial sector across the UK and the world. But you know, there's other things that we know tend to be associated with high-performing, high-productivity cities that Edinburgh and Glasgow both have. You know, public transport infrastructure, yeah, especially again comparing to Northern England cities, they compare pretty well. The Edinburgh Tram extension has kind of built on that, and so transport and also culture as well. So we've looked at different cities around the world that have kind of successfully made the transition to a services-based economy, and a consistent theme is it's just being an attractive place to live for high-skilled and particularly graduate workers. And transport is part of that. People want to live close to the centre and not be particularly reliant on cars to get around, and also having kind of cultural footprint. So, Edinburgh obviously great for culture, and increasingly Glasgow too. So I think yes, those two cities are something that Scotland has. They're both very good assets for Scotland in terms of its productivity performance.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener.
Thanks for that, Gordon. Can I bring in Murdo Fraser?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. Lorna Slater mentioned earlier the issue of the productivity puzzle, which doesn't just impact us in the UK or in Scotland, but is a much broader issue across Western economies. And what I'd like to ask is, are there examples from other countries that are doing better than we are? I'll maybe start with yourself, Simon, because you referenced some of the international studies you'd done. We recently had Sir Tom Hunter, who's one of Scotland's leading business figures and entrepreneurs, saying Scotland needs to be more like Singapore. So I'm wondering if Singapore is doing any better than we are, or if there are other examples elsewhere in the world we can learn from and try to implement some of what they've done in terms of trying to tackle the productivity puzzle that we have here.
Yeah, I think, Singapore is a difficult comparison point. We are geographically very far away from them, culturally very different, and the kind of economic context, both in terms of the size, like geographic size and location in the world economy, is very different. I think what we've done is look a bit closer to home, and there really are some, we don't need to be so radical as to say we need to be like Singapore to have some pretty chunky improvements. So if you look at productivity in particular, obviously the US is it's kind of at the frontier in terms of large economies, but also France and Germany. There's a there has opened up a pretty big gap between us and them, which if you compare to France, for example, on GDP or GDP per capita, the gap isn't huge, but actually if you look at productivity, the gap is much larger than you might think, and that's because France has kind of spent some of their higher productivity in working less. And so, to David's point earlier, that's one of the benefits you can get. So, what explains some of those gaps? Our research suggested with France in particular, the biggest single driver of that gap is how much investment we have done in the past and how much capital workers have compared to in Britain and France. So French workers have about 40% more capital to work with than British workers, and that's a particularly big, that's a big explainer there. So, and where there are particular weaknesses for British investment, so we do particularly badly on physical investment. We've seen a drop off in R&D and corporate investment, particularly since the financial crisis, and that's a kind of thing that has continued through the pandemic. So, there are definitely some comparators closer to home, just across the channel, that are doing much better than us on productivity. And, we have a good evidence base to suggest that we know what some of the drivers of those are.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Maybe I could ask Professor Wessels the same question. And just to open it up a bit, there was a report the Productivity Institute came out in January looking at comparisons within Scotland, and you were suggesting that Glasgow is an area where productivity underperforms comparable cities. So maybe you can answer the question about international comparisons, but also look at why bits within Scotland are doing not as well as other bits.
Yeah, I think following on from Simon, that's really helpful, Simon, but just sort of thinking through that question around Singapore, I think maybe one way to look at it is looking at the strengths within Scotland. So if we think of what's, we can look at, yes, Germany and France, I think Fair Work, that kind of thing is really, really important. But I think if we look at Denmark, look at the Netherlands, that sort of thing as well, looking at comparative size of countries, what they're doing and what Scotland's doing. But I think it's thinking about the strengths within Scotland. So, for instance, we've got sort of and emerging areas as well. So existing strengths such as finance are really important, and services, and they're well established. But I think also the aspirations. So Edinburgh, for example, wants to see itself as a data centre for Europe. So looking ahead to, if you like, the data economy is really important. I think looking at Aberdeen, we know that the fossil fuels are going down, but looking at renewable energy and space and those sorts of things. It's sort of looking at the strength of Scotland. And I think then bringing it right back to Glasgow, it's kind of thinking Glasgow's kind of world leading in precision medicine. So in a sense, looking at particular sectors and where those strengths are. And that's often, there's quite a long history in developing that capacity and capability, and as an attractor, because Simon and David have talked about certain sectors and businesses attracting the high skills and being attractive. So I think Glasgow's quite, so taking it right back to Glasgow now, why is Glasgow not performing as well as Edinburgh? I think in terms of advanced manufacturing, specialised health, it does have those really kind of high-end leading manufacturing innovative businesses. It has that. It has a very good university, I would say that, wouldn't I? But versus kind of Edinburgh. So it's got a similar kind of infrastructure. It's got good transport systems. But I think it has lower levels of good health. So there's more people economically inactive due to health. It's also got greater inequalities in terms of a deindustrialised city, that then bringing through people who are living in less affluent areas with probably less opportunity to engage in or think through pathways into higher education or further education. And again, there's more people economically inactive. And I think that is very much, again, we talked about intra-regional, but I think that's, if you like, the shape of the city. And it's overcoming some of those the legacy of deindustrialisation, post-industrial city, and having factors to draw in that talent. Now, that talent is vital, particularly as we're moving to a more data centre, AI-centred or digital future. Dame Wendy Hall argues, for any kind of AI-enabled economy, we have to have diversity within the workforce to ensure that that AI is responsible and can address the diversity it's drawing on. So there's a huge potential in Glasgow, but at the moment it's untapped, although it is improving. The latest figures that came out only last week from Glasgow City Council shows that actually it is improving.
Thank you very much for that. That's a very helpful response. What you've just said about Glasgow, though, surely could also be said about other major industrial cities in the UK, Newcastle, Liverpool, Manchester.
Yeah.
How is Glasgow comparing to them, and is there any explanation for any difference in outcome?
So if we kind of think around, if we compare ourselves to Liverpool and Manchester, say, actually Glasgow is doing a wee bit better. But Manchester and Liverpool have taken different approaches to deal with those problems. So they've taken, I've got to look at this, I can't kind of remember off the top of my head, but it's often a much more regional governance approach. So very much like a mayoral approach, sort of regional governance. So it's more about how they've brought that together. They've also fostered much more investment at the regional level, so understood that more regionally. I still think, and this is something that's anecdotal, I think what's quite interesting when we look the way Manchester's developing, it is at risk of gentrifying and growing very much at the centre. It's reliance on a lot of external international funding, and there are areas that are left behind in Manchester, and I think it's then that inclusive growth and bringing people through, which might be a question of how sustainable that growth actually is. Liverpool, because Simon talked very much about the creative industries, Liverpool is kind of rebranding itself very much through its creative sector and is invested in museums and so on. But whether that's going to attract that high value advanced manufacturing, at a level that will improve productivity is unknown.
And if I can come in there quickly, I think we shouldn't sort of downplay too much Glasgow. I think, as both Professor Wessels and Simon were saying, it actually performs relatively well compared to kind of secondary cities elsewhere in the UK. The only ones that do better are kind of say Bristol. So, you know, the south of England there. And actually, I think we also shouldn't forget a bit of the geography of Glasgow. So if you look at Glasgow City Council, that tends to look worse because actually its richest suburbs are actually not in Glasgow Council. They're East Renfrewshire and East Dunbartonshire, whereas Edinburgh's richest suburbs are within the Edinburgh city boundary. And then if you look at the sub-regions of Scotland, so if you look at Eastern Scotland, which is basically the Lothians and Fife and sort of Angus, median earnings there are currently 102% of median earnings in the UK as a whole, so just above average in terms of median. West Central Scotland, which is basically the area on Glasgow, 101.5%. So very similar median earnings. Mean earnings in both lag the UK as a whole. In Eastern Scotland, it's 94%. In Western Scotland, 91%. Basically showing that where you've got that gap is not sort of like typical pay, it's at that very top, and that's perhaps a little bit more noticeable in Glasgow in its area than Edinburgh in its area. But we shouldn't sort of downplay, you know, the success of these areas. I think actually, you know, the secondary cities of the UK can be looking to Scotland for some of the kind of lessons in terms of productivity here. Although I should say, the sort of big improvement of Scotland's productivity took place really between sort of like 2000 and about 2010, 2011. The last 12, 13 years has been a sort of like a bit of a treading water, sort of like slightly cyclical pattern.
Thanks, David Phillips. Maybe I could ask you then the question I started with about international comparisons and any other countries, whether it's Singapore or anywhere else, you think we could learn some lessons from?
So this isn't my area of expertise, really, but I would sort of echo the kind of point about looking at kind of more comparative countries for sort of, you know, general lessons rather than Singapore. That doesn't mean not looking at Singapore at all. I think one kind of look at kind of the way they operate their social security system is really quite different to the UK's, and there could be some lessons, positive or negative, to draw from that. But yes, I would say there's more scope to learn from, Western European countries, maybe kind of Canada, the United States, and I would also sort of echo one of the things that Simon said there. I think we often in the UK don't realise actually on many fronts, France actually performs really strongly. On productivity, France does better than Germany, for example. The Germans get higher output. That's because they work a bit more than the French. I think in terms of hourly productivity, France is sort of not far behind the US. At least historically, that was the case. So we should look at our Gallic cousins, the old alliance.
Maybe we should drink more wine and eat more cheese. Is that what you're saying? Great. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Murdo. Can I bring in the Deputy Convener?
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. And actually, David, while you're on the screen, I'll just keep you there. We've talked a lot in general terms about productivity, and I think we all understand the factors that drive productivity, but relative weighting within them, and I'm thinking about things such as major infrastructure projects, housing, where you've got economic multipliers. What is your sense of the relative weighting that would give us really quite a significant boost to productivity of all the factors that influence productivity? Oh.
I'm unmuted now.
All right.
So in terms of the fact, I mean, I'll again sort of say I don't have a kind of particularly strong answer here. I actually think that intermediate, well, I haven't got a strong answer, but I'll just give some, kind of high-level suggestions of areas I would look at into more detail. The first is I would look at intermediate-level skills. I think Scotland actually does relatively well there compared to the rest of the UK, but is that translating into sort of job opportunities for people with intermediate skills? Or is the fact that we have kind of quite sort of a university-focused sort of education system in the wider UK, meaning that these people in Scotland that have these skills between high school and university, they're sort of falling in the gaps, basically, because employers don't know, how to handle them. So I would look at kind of, is Scotland's, intermediate skills translating into outcomes for those people? Secondly, I think kind of I would look at management skills. I think kind of one of the things that was in the NSET is a bit of a focus on management. I'm not sure whether the kind of initiatives in there will actually deliver. I'm not saying they won't. I think we need to evaluate them, but I think actually a focus on management is a good thing to see, because I think there's often things that it's overlooked when it comes to productivity. And the last is, I think that, again, this wasn't in the NSET. Another thing kind of missing there, I think, is thinking about how the kind of tax system can impact on productivity. I think we've seen kind of the tax system evolve in ways across the UK, but actually particularly in Scotland, in ways that can reduce productivity. And I think in particularly here, the big increase we've seen in the reliance on stamp duty land tax, or in Scotland LBTT. This is a tax which basically makes it harder for people to move to get jobs, for businesses to get better premises. It gums up the property market. There are better ways to raise revenue from high-value properties, if that's what you want, than a tax on when those properties are transacted. And whilst, you know, tax probably isn't the single biggest impact on productivity, it is one of the ones that's most directly under the government's control. It's a lever they can pull quite straightforwardly. So I think that looking at the tax strategy, which was published earlier this year, and thinking actually how do we align that tax strategy with the economic growth strategy, I think is kind of an important route forward. Because the tax strategy did have a section on economic growth, but it's how can we grow the economy to boost taxes. You also need to go the other way around. How can we reform taxes to support economic growth and productivity within the kind of context of the other objectives around tackling poverty, raising money for public services? But there's basically better ways to raise revenue than Scotland's currently doing, just as there's better ways to raise revenue than England and Wales are currently doing.
And before everyone else comes in, but is that simply not a function? You mentioned, or you reference LBTT, that there are hardly any taxes that Scotland can raise, whilst I strongly agree with you about increasing money flowing through the economy. I completely agree with that. Yeah. But surely that's a function of that. The LBTT is in some respects low-hanging fruit that the Scottish Government can utilise in the absence of other taxes.
Well, we know what happened when Adam kind of pulled down the low-hanging fruit and ate the apple. I think, you know, LBTT is somewhat of a poisoned fruit, unfortunately. I think it does do damage to the economic performance of Scotland, as it is down south. It's just that Scotland's gone a bit further on this. I agree with you that there are, you know, a limited range of tax powers for Scotland, and you can see that if certain other powers had devolved, you could do, you know, more things to kind of, you know, think about the system as a whole. But actually, property tax is one area where the key levers are basically devolved to Scotland. You've got you've got LBTT, you've got council tax, you've got business rates. Hopefully now we're seeing a little bit of a move with this sort of engagement on council tax to think about how we can kind of think about the property tax system as a whole. But for many, many years, we had a freeze on council tax, which is probably one of the least economically damaging taxes that Scotland has. We saw kind of, you know, as in England, you know, 33 years of inability to act or unwillingness to act on revaluation or the sort of, you know, much on the kind of progressivity of the tax. So I think in general, you can see, yes, with sort of more tax powers devolved to Scotland, there would be more scope to do more on, say, income tax and the different treatments between employment and self-employment and small businesses, or more to encourage investment. When it comes to property, a lot of the levers are already in Scotland. It's just the will and the confidence and the courage to actually make use of those levers to forge a system that can be both fairer and more efficient. I think that is that's a fruit that should be grabbed, not the tempting but dangerous fruit of LBTT increases.
And perhaps Bridget might like to come in next, but opening out the conversation, I'm interested in the historical impacts of low investment in capital projects and infrastructure. And that's been a historic issue with the UK for 30-odd years, really. And I'm interested in what your thoughts are of how that has ultimately affected productivity, given that infrastructure projects we know can often turn, even if it's a temporary thing, can turn things around a bit. So, Bridget, perhaps you'd like to come in next.
Right, thank you very much. I think you really get me to think at different sort of levels. I think in terms of infrastructure, and it was really following on from David and your question to David, we've just finished a project on purpose in business and those purpose-driven approaches. And what we found, the successful businesses, and it goes back to the very first question, why productivity? And we found that if there's this purpose approach, that actually the companies and the businesses are using their resources in a much more effective and efficient way. But in thinking that through, they're also innovating. Now, why does that lead to infrastructure? And I think one of the things is if we're thinking around the ways in which companies are becoming more productive, and they're becoming more productive not just in the bottom line profit, but in terms of skilling up their workplace, in investing in community, that can be very local, but it also is an international in scale, is that it's about facilitating a trusted, resilient ecosystem that's sustainable. So I think it's thinking about infrastructure in terms of ecosystems and what needs to join up where. And so it's not just saying, right, we've got all this old infrastructure, we're going to chuck it out and we're going to rebuild from scratch. It's that really tricky problem of the legacy systems and how you then foster change in a sustainable way, and that is informed by the needs of businesses as well as local place. And I think, therefore, it's about thinking more strategically, and it again is back to that leadership approach and that management issue of the skills aren't just about learning to do things mechanically and routine skills. It's about facilitating that sort of the skill in understanding what needs to join up, how to connect it, and how to foster change. Because the problem with, I think, past infrastructures is once you've built it, it soon gets outdated. And then it's all set in stone and you're not flexible and adaptable enough to meet changing markets, whether that's changing markets locally, nationally within Scotland, in the UK or internationally. So I think it's thinking about infrastructure as an ecosystem and understanding how to do that. And we are at a moment of change in terms of digital and AI. There's a lot of hype around it, but it's thinking through how you develop and foster a really good set of data that's reliable for intelligence-led businesses and public sector. And it's then understanding how you move different aspects of an ecosystem, move it to join up to gain, if you like, advantage from that ecosystem. So if we think about an example in the Highlands and Islands work with census, for example, is that there's a lot of very small businesses there. They would really benefit from sort of digital infrastructure, AI infrastructure, but each of them on their own, the investment and return on investment is too long. But if you could look at that as an infrastructure and enable that clustering, that you've got the basis, but then there's adaptability for them to adapt to their specific needs, then I think you've got the magic bullet. So I think it is thinking about infrastructure slightly differently in terms of ecosystem.
Thank you. And Simon, any last comments from the sort of range of questions I've asked?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on a few things. So one, on infrastructure spend, one thing that's important to keep in mind is not just the level of spend that matters, but also its volatility is really important. So the National Infrastructure Commission looked at this in quite a lot of detail at the UK level and compared us to Germany, where if you look at rail electrification, which is kind of a classic example of this, the Germans kind of electrify, I think it's about 300,000 kilometres. It's some number, but it's fairly constant every year. Whereas we, will have big spurt of action and then nothing for a few years and then maybe a bit the year after. And what that means is the infrastructure and the ecosystem around that is unable to operate in an efficient way. If you know that there's going to be this steady demand for your services, you can make your own investments in your processes and know that they will pay off. Whereas in the UK, you don't have that certainty. So you're unable to make those improvements, and everything's just a bit stop-start, and there's always the various costs around the frictions of getting started again. So, if thinking about infrastructure, wherever it is, having a set, credible plan for this is what we're going to do over, some number of years, can give you better results than just saying, we're going to spend this in the short term without giving people the certainty. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing I was going to touch on was you asked about what gives you the best bang for your buck, if I can paraphrase it that way. So we did some research at the Resolution Foundation looking into this, looking at the evidence across advanced economies, so empirical studies that have looked at this question. And what struck me is just the variation in the estimates is huge. And I think that reflects both, there's noise in the data and these things are difficult to estimate, but also that there is genuine variation in payoff. And I think one thing that's particularly key there is just having, local knowledge about what's bit of investment will unlock the most things. And that's something that, you can't really know from the outside. And I think that is driving some of these differences. So putting the decision, or having the decisions made at the right level by people with the right in-depth knowledge of their local economies is really key for getting the most bang for your buck, rather than saying, this spending on trains will get you more than spending on housing or roads. It's much more nuanced and kind of case specific than that. So yeah, I was just going to add those to what others have said.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks very much. So can I bring in Willie Coffey?
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, everyone. I wonder if I could continue to lock you into the discussion about the regional imbalance within Scotland, and I'm thinking in particular my own area in Ayrshire. When you compare it with other parts of Scotland, principally the east and the north. I've been a member of this Parliament now for about 18 years, and the indicators for my community in Ayrshire, Kilmarnock and Irvine Valley specifically, if you look at employment, if you look at earnings, health inequalities and poverty, they've always lagged behind Scotland all that time. And despite being awash with strategies, you were talking about that, Bridget, earlier, we seem to have a lot of strategies that pop up every now and again. The picture, by and large, hasn't really changed in all that time that I've been here. So it's just to ask your reflections on why you think that is. Do the governments know how to do this, how to close these gaps? And do you see within the current strategies, perhaps the NSET strategy, do you see the opportunity in that to reduce these regional imbalances, perhaps not just for Ayrshire, but Colin Smith's area, Dumfries and Galloway too, to try and bridge this gap that's clearly there and been there for many years?
I mean, it's a very, very tricky problem. Health inequalities, social inequality, economic inequality has a long, it becomes embedded in place. And I think you've got the ageing population, you've got ill health, you've got all those factors that to some extent can limit aspiration. It's almost going, and also it limits inward investment. There's a sense of, so I think there are really good examples. So, I mean, just to sort of take the WISE group working here in Glasgow, there are third sector organisations that can actually start to bridge, those people who might feel they've got less opportunity, but they've got enormous potential. So it's about how and it's a slow process. So I think you've got to think of the short, medium and longer term. So I think it's about, and I think Simon and David have talked about that, it's about starting to learn how to configure and develop policy on the ground that can improve health and health outcomes. That's good housing, health support that's targeted to particular needs around the health inequalities in that place. It's about fostering innovative kind of career pathways. And there are examples of where sort of local businesses, where you've got sort of internships and you've got apprenticeships that are of specific value that can bring young people through into those businesses. That, I think, has to be combined with finding ways to invest in businesses and make the place look attractive for investment. So it's a huge problem, but I think you can do it. I think there's the infrastructure in Scotland to do that, but I think it's about understanding in particular where the blocks are and how you ease that. Now, some of that will be a longer term project. Other bits might be, where can you create that intervention? So if we think about working from home, and if we think about people with sort of disability, what can be provided to, if you like, improve employment opportunities for people with certain disabilities and for women? So, for example, working from home, but also digital working in all its different forms is much more attractive to people with sort of disability or women. So there's probably a lot of talent in there that you could actually look at how can you foster that inclusion in the workplace, for example. I think the schools, it's linking the schools up to sort of businesses, local businesses. And there are examples within Scotland, not so much where you are, where even small businesses have a sort of internship academy and skill young people up into kind of workplace socialisation of workplace norms, working practices and so on. And there's examples of where that's been really successful. Another example is looking at, thinking about young people, is often apprenticeships are 2 years, and sometimes young people find after 6 months it's not for them. How can you modulise apprenticeships so people can build different skills bases? It's not so good for the businesses, but it might again build capacity and capability within the younger population. I can't give a magic bullet on this, sorry.
Thanks for that, Bridget. Simon, David, do you have any thoughts on why we've had such a long period of time, perhaps lagging behind Scotland, in my part of Scotland, Ayrshire, for example, and what we really need to do to try and turn that round, and whether you see the opportunity for that in the strategies that are in front of us?
Go on, David.
Okay. So I don't have a great insight to kind of Ayrshire in particular. What we do know is that regional inequalities are very, very long-lived. If you look at kind of the areas that had low wages, low employment 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even 30 years ago, they're pretty similar. There was then quite a big change, between kind of the 1960s and the early 1990s with kind of a deindustrialisation. So I think kind of probably Ayrshire is in one of those areas which kind of suffered from elements of deindustrialisation, and unlike, say, some of the cities which then had the sort of agglomeration and size that sort of, reinvent themselves to some extent, at least as kind of service economies, it didn't have that. Now, in terms of kind of why we've not seen success on this, I think one reason, unfortunately, is that we wouldn't expect in an economy to have all areas sort of performing at a similar level. You would expect there to be some degree of economic inequality between places, unfortunately. I think the important thing in that context, though, is to make sure that you have a public sector, public services that support people in those areas, both in terms of addressing their needs, but also making sure that they have opportunities to access that. So that means like education and skills and so on, and actually that you have a redistributive local government funding system to make sure that there's support for those services in those areas. But I think probably there's also been kind of a bit of policy churn basically over time, almost kind of like a proliferation of short-ish term strategies that, don't seem to work over kind of a political time frame and then sort of get replaced by something a little bit different. And what we've seen a bit of back and forth on at the UK level, I'm less sure what it is in Scotland, is, should it be cities or should it be towns? And it kind of flips a bit between the two depending on where the politics is. And actually it should be both, but in different ways. Towns have a different role to play in the economy than cities do. And, for example, putting a government hub in a small town probably isn't a catalyst in the same way as it is kind of putting it in a city where you can kind of get, some agglomeration effects around it. One thing that's noticeable about NSET is that whilst it talks about, regions, it hasn't got any targets or policies specifically related to regions. So one of the good things about, say, the previous UK government's levelling up white paper was it did have quite a clear sense of, like, these are the issues and these are strategies, and here are some measurable targets for geographical inequalities. Now, whether there was the resources, whether there was the will behind to actually address this stuff, question, but it did sort of identify and place targets on this. That isn't an NSET. There's a target for earnings growth, but there's no target for earnings inequality across places. There's a recognition that there's need for a regional economic strategy, but less of a sort of idea about, well, actually, the strategy is a different role for cities and a different role for city hinterlands and rural areas. So I think whilst not calling for another strategy, as I said, I think there's been kind of a proliferation of strategies. I think kind of fleshing this one out a little bit more about what it means in terms of regional inequalities, I think would be kind of an important next step. Because at the moment, there's nothing to even hold the government to account to, let alone sort of, strategies related specifically to narrowing gaps between different parts of Scotland in the NSET.
Thanks for that, David. Simon, any different views that you could share about this and how we might look forward to closing these particular regional imbalances in my part of Scotland?
Yeah, so I think one thing I would say is, we know that we talked a bit about agglomeration effects and the fact that productivity, high productive sectors can cluster in cities, and there's some research that suggests that those are particularly important in the services sectors. So as the UK has deindustrialised and moved towards a service-led economy, those agglomeration forces have got stronger. So you're almost fighting against the tide in a sense that the kind of structural change in the economy left to their own devices might be expected to kind of widen some of these gaps. So the fact that these gaps have remained persistent isn't necessarily surprising, given the structural changes that have happened, and speaks to why this is such a difficult challenge to address. I think I'd just echo David's point about something the NSET could do more of, or you should have at least clear in your minds of what does success for Ayrshire look like. I think we talked a lot about productivity, and it's productivity in a region is an indicator of the number of high quality jobs and the level of Professor Wessel said aspiration that people can have looking at the area around them. But often what matters for people's lived experiences is their income. So is success for Ayrshire having people growing up and having the skills and transport links to access higher paying jobs in Glasgow, for example, rather than those jobs moving to where they are. So I think that on the wider point of where the NSET can flesh out a bit more on the regional side, I think that's a specific point about what does success look like for different regions, given that we know we're not going to have an Edinburgh or a Glasgow in every area of Scotland.
Thanks for that, Simon. You've introduced a thorny subject there about transport links. For me, for young people in Ayrshire, for example, if they wanted to work in the capital city in Scotland, Edinburgh, they face a journey of 2 hours plus. They not only have to change trains, but they've got to change railway stations in order to do that, to get a distance of about 65 miles. It's just ridiculous. So is the transport infrastructure one of the key drivers for this? Because it really affects depopulation in my part of Scotland, where people will vote with their feet and they'll move away rather than make that kind of journey on a daily basis to work in Scotland's capital city, because they just don't do it and they don't commute.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the northwest of England, so I'm very well acquainted with taking extremely long and arduous railway journeys to cover not very much distance. I think that is your constituents better than anyone. But if that is something that you think people don't necessarily need to have a high-paid job in the town or where they live, but actually having easy, convenient access to high-paid jobs not that far away as the crow flies, if that's something that would kind of fulfil their sense of pride in their local area, which is something that I think we're kind of skirting around when we talk about these regional inequalities. Yeah, I think it's definitely true that transport infrastructure could be part of the solution, but there are trade-offs here, right? If you're investing in intercity transport links, that might mean you invest less in intracity transport links, or even outside the transport sector. So I have no doubt that better transport links between Ayrshire and Edinburgh would, improve the labour market outcomes for people in Ayrshire. But from there are other problems that people are facing in Ayrshire and elsewhere that you need to kind of weigh that off against.
Yeah, thanks for that. My last question for you, if I may, Convener, the whole artificial intelligence revolution that we're kind of at the beginning of, the cusp of, do you think that could be an agent for change to reduce regional inequalities in Scotland, or do you think it's more likely to just make the wealthier parts of Scotland more wealthier? Should we make a concerted effort to try and avoid that?
Don't mind who I can.
Bridget, do you want to take this one?
You would start first, and then we can. As with all technological change, there's winners and losers. And I certainly think, you have got centres of strength and excellence like Edinburgh, kind of London. You've got that cluster, you've got those accelerators, you've got those catapults. But there is huge potential if it's sort of like community wealth building, or it's developing anchor organisations in these other areas where AI-supported work can actually be fostered. And I think there's something about thinking about working in a hub and spoke model. So if we have got a centre of excellence in Scotland, how do you get satellites out to places in Ayrshire and foster that upskilling of AI skills? Now, some of those skills are going to be quite routine, but there's an awful lot of kind of quite creative sort of aspects of this new economy as it's emerging. What we don't know is some jobs will be automated, so some jobs will be lost, but some of the more creative and data-centred jobs will be there. And I think you could then look at the ways in which businesses might run on that hub and spoke. So then I think it's about fostering good relations with some of the leaders. So you gain that intelligence about the way AI is going, developing capacity and capability within your area in order to make sure that you're not leaders, but you're in that next tier of adopters that can actually move quite quickly. And I think it's moving, but it's moving quite slowly. So to position yourself strategically, link into, if you like, those centres of excellence might be one way to ensure that you don't get left behind in that space. Young people in particular, we've just finished a minimum digital living standards project for Scotland. And I think in order for different areas to actually make sure that you keep up, I think the infrastructure, good digital infrastructure that's secure, robust, resilient, is really important. But also there is a huge amount of potential in young people. They are, if you like, the digital generation. They sometimes can't go behind the system, but they think very creatively with some of this kind of the way in which data is visualised and worked. And I think, building on some of that potential in the schools early on is really important, and linking in that kind of hub and spoke model would sort of certainly help towards mitigating a wider division.
Thanks, Bridget. Any views on that, David, Simon?
I wouldn't want to make any sort of long-term predictions about kind of the future sort of economic development of AI. I'm sort of in two minds myself about whether this is kind of like, a different type of technology compared to previous technologies, and, past technologies have always kind of created more interesting jobs for humans to do. Is this different because this is now kind of quite an intellectual thing? So I'm in sort of two minds myself about how this might develop. I think kind of I would emphasise again what Professor Wessel said, that there will be winners and there will be losers, and a strategy to kind of help losers adapt, I think, will be important. So kind of an emphasis on kind of retraining and perhaps, you know, retraining and skilling in later life, which the UK traditionally hasn't been very good at. One thing that I think, you know, this links up a bit to as well is that we have an ageing population, and a noticeable, you know, absence from, I think, all strategies is kind of thinking about the combination of retraining and ageing. How do you actually design training so that it's suitable for people in their kind of 50s and even in their 60s, their kind of longer working lives, which is probably particularly important for areas which have seen a bit more of an outflow of younger people. What I'll say now might be slightly controversial. I think that we probably should accept that there will be areas of countries that will see a relative decline in their population. We do see economic geography change over time. The areas that are most populous in our country now are not the same as 100 years ago, and they weren't the same as 200 years ago, and so on, because people do move to where there's economic opportunity. I think what you need to get right there is make sure that people don't get stranded, but don't get stranded in communities that are falling behind, and that means investing in both the kind of supportive public services like health, social care, and so on, so that older people that kind of, you know, stay in these areas don't find themselves without support, but also that young people find themselves with opportunities, both if they want to stay in the local area, and that can be via those, you know, health, education, public sector type roles, and there will be some private sector type roles there as well. But also, if they do commute away or even move away, they can access those jobs by making sure that you really invest in kind of good quality education in more remote areas. And I think actually that's one area where technology can play a role. We actually have seen quite a big change in the last few years. Traditionally, it was kind of hardest to get doctors and teachers into towns and into like expensive cities because the cost of living. But now actually you see it's much easier to recruit doctors and teachers in urban areas, and it's the more rural areas that struggle to get them. Can technology, can AI provide a role to actually get some more access to kind of more courses, more treatment options in sort of local communities like in Asia, or even more so perhaps in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland?
Okay. Thanks, David. Last word, Simon.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing to remember is that the UK is not amazing at adopting technologies. And I thought it was really good to see in the NSET that there's quite a specific focus on digitisation and supporting the rollout of that. So what I would say is don't put the cart before the horse and get worried about, you know, downstream impacts of widespread rapid AI adoption, because, you know, history has said often we are kind of slow in getting there. So yeah, focusing on helping businesses and equipping businesses with the skills to make these changes, having workers able to adapt to them, and then, as David says, thinking more generally about, okay, these changes are happening, what can we do through the public sector to ensure that the transitions that they bring about are kind of smooth and feel fair to people.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much. Can I bring in Jamie Halcrow-Johnson?
Thanks very much. That's very interesting. That was actually the area I just kind of wanted to kind of expand a little bit further on. Before I do that, you obviously talked about, in response to Willie Coffey's questions, about transport infrastructure and some of the issues around that. I mean, I don't need to tell you the Highlands and Islands is an area where transport infrastructure is a major issue, and perhaps actually, you know, while we would like to see better connections, actually making it those connections more productive, for example, actually reliable Wi-Fi on a lot of those connections may be a really good place to start, and that's actually something that you would have thought could be rolled out far more cheaply and quickly than perhaps some of the upgrades. But that was just a slightly Highlands and Islands point I was going to make there, and I won't mention the Coronarios ferry and some of the connections like that, because it only winds up my colleagues. I really wanted to talk about what we've just been talking about, digitalisation. There are so many areas, and I think the point Professor Wessels, you made around kind of clustering, the need to bring in different groups together, because, you know, perhaps there isn't that ability to work as small SMEs, for example. And I wanted to kind of take that to the next level, and that's would appear to me to be around a kind of national approach to this. The Finance Committee that I was previously on visited Estonia to look at the work that they're doing, and they've obviously taken everything pretty much and put it online. And the way they, remembering what I do from the many meetings we had, which were absolutely fascinating, was that they created a central framework, the parameters, the security, the rules, essentially, and then allow different parts of their public sector and their economy to add on to that, but very much working within those rules. Is that an approach that you would like to see in Scotland? Is it feasible for us to do it, and what benefits could it bring? And I suppose what risks could it have? And if I can come to Professor Wessels first.
I mean, absolutely. I think the Baltic states years and years ago, when they actually, once they'd gained their independence, they rebuilt their economy on the back of what was then called an information society policy. So, and I think that was backed with money through European Union as well. And they're small countries, and the legacy systems weren't there. So they could actually, some of the early leaders, lessons had been learnt in Europe. We'd learnt what the issues were about making that digital shift and how to do that on many different levels, whether that was organisational change, digital inclusion, knowing how to articulate the needs that you need for a particular technology and embed it and so on, looking at accountability and security, absolutely vital. So they could take those lessons and actually innovate very quickly, because there wasn't the legacy system there. And so they could innovate, and they did have that joined up sense of what was needed and how you built that infrastructure. Now, a similar but much smaller kind of example this is again going way back, is the example of London. I was doing work in the London Borough of Newham, but also across London, and we developed this sense of Easy Connect. It was kind of the Easy movement, Easy Connects movement, which actually then went out to different regions in England, was how do you, for digital to work, it's around having that digital infrastructure that's interoperable, that can connect and leverage, if you like, the resources in it. So, and how do you do that? So it's about understanding the basis of what that infrastructure looks like. How do you make it secure? How do you make it resilient, but also increasingly sustainable? One of the key factors around AI is the sustainability, because it's going to take an awful lot of energy. But then how do you have that link from that, whereby different companies or businesses or public sector or third sector can adapt and fit and fix it into their organisation? And I think the fitting and the fixing isn't just about the technology, it's about understanding the economics of the service. So if you're thinking around, one example could be, we developed local service one-stop shops in Newham, and we looked at the price of paper, face-to-face consultation, phone call and digital self-help. And we worked through the economics of that, and then through that could really identify what technologies to use when in order to deliver an efficient service. So I think, yes, I think there is a sense to understand it nationally, where that investment needs to be. I think there's also another question, if we think about the telephone, universal provision of telephones up in the Highlands and Islands was because there was a policy that saw there might not be a business case for it, but actually it was needed. So I think thinking around that, universal policy for digital to be embedded across Scotland, in the Highlands and Islands as well, as an infrastructure, building the security and the resilience within that, but then enabling businesses and the public sector to be able to articulate their needs in terms of its best use. And I think it is possible.
That's really interesting, and I'll come to Simon and David after that. But one of the things that the ministry responsible spoke to us about was the procurement process and how they do that. And, you know, in this country, we seem to have lots of different organisations that kind of come up with a need, tender out a bespoke solution, and provided a bespoke solution, invariably it goes wrong or it doesn't work quite to it was. And what they were saying in Estonia was that they actually work with the potential tender companies before they put it out to tender to really go through all the problems first. And then only when they've got a kind of workable solution do they kind of go to that tender. Is that something that should be done here, could be done, is being done in some examples?
I think it's absolutely essential. And I think I did some work on e-government in England and Wales. This is going back a long time now. But what the local authorities found was that actually the private sector, the IT suppliers, didn't really understand the needs of the businesses or the public sector, and the public sector didn't really know how to articulate those needs. So that's where you get the risks, and that's where you get the failures. So I think there is that sense of much more co-construction, co-design approach. Go to Sweden. Sweden have been very good at that. So looking at Sweden as an example about how to co-construct and co-design a digital infrastructure for a particular place is a good place to look. But definitely in the procurement is absolutely vital. We really found that.
Thank you. David, do you want to come in, and then Simon?
I don't have much to add on this. I think I agree with you that there can be issues in procurement in terms of, you know, kind of being able to specify what you need and the understanding. I think elements of co-production can be helpful. In designing that, you need to make sure you design a system which avoids capture by particular sort of important suppliers. So you still need to be mindful of, in effect, the risk of, you know, corruption. So in doing that, I think that whatever arrangements you have for sort of a co-productive approach, that it's kind of open access, and that there's kind of like make sure there can be kind of proper scrutiny, not just by government, but also by external parties, to kind of make sure that there isn't inappropriate capture, if you like, of those relationships. Yeah, that's the only point I would add on that.
Thanks, David. Simon?
Yeah, nothing to add from me on this one.
I think just to come back in, I think it's absolutely crucial, because there is that, you know, the power issue. But Croydon, for example, years ago did an outcomes approach. So rather than actually looking at the contract they had with IT suppliers, it wasn't just about putting the kit in and any kind of post-kit looking after. It was the outcomes in terms of productivity. So looking at the contract, I think, is really, really important. And of course, you know, be careful that you don't that the technocrats don't get hold of the power in that relationship.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, can I bring in Lorna Slater?
Thank you very much, Convener. I was going to move now to the some questions around tax powers and fiscal powers. I'm curious as to how you feel about whether there is an alignment between what we see in NSET as intentions of the Scottish Government and decisions that they've actually been making in the budget. I know for myself, I've found it very hard when scrutinising the budget to understand how the budget contributes to NSET, but maybe you've got more insight into that.
This is not my area of expertise, so I think I'll hand over.
Sounds like one for David.
David.
Yes. So I think to be fair to the Scottish Government, I wouldn't expect the budget to kind of like list out each of the strategies to which each of its policies and spending announcements links to, in part because there are so many strategies across the Scottish public sector, as we've just discussed. But what I think was a little bit disappointing was that in the actual NSET progress reports, I think that is an opportunity to kind of link back on a more systematic basis to the budget decisions that have been taken, and actually to link back to the kind of like tables of like priority actions and priority areas. To some extent, it's a format issue, but I think the kind of formatting of the NSET updates is almost sort of designed to obfuscate rather than really illuminate where progress has and hasn't been made on the strategies. Actually just use the same format, the same boxes, the same headings, and kind of like have a like narrative list and any kind of funding commitments or spending amounts listed to it, using the same format, the same headings and so on. Because I think when I looked back at the NSET progress report and then back to the NSET, you know, you could see a link between the two, but it wasn't made as easy as possible, and certainly not linking, as you say, back to the budget. I'm not sure the budget document is the place to do it. It's already quite a long document, but either a document alongside the budget or the NSET review, I think there is scope to put more information there.
The next question I'd like to ask is around tax powers, and in this case, it would both be around tax powers that are devolved to the Scottish Government, but also I'm interested in your thoughts about revenue raising by local authorities and how both of those tools can be used to improve our regional gaps and regional inequality and improve productivity. Certainly, obviously, the Scottish Government has limited powers of taxation in its own right, but it could bequeath more powers onto local authorities, for example, through reform of council tax. Other ideas have been things like, you know, cruise ship levies, carbon land tax, and so on. Are these useful tools for tackling regional inequality and improving productivity in the regions?
If I come on this one first again, I think that I would see primarily tax reform and tax devolution more about two things. One is improving the efficiency and the fairness of the tax system, kind of across Scotland as a whole. And I think, as I mentioned there, kind of some combination of revalued and more progressive council tax, a lower or abolished LBTT, reforms to business rates so that it's sort of, you know, less distortive in terms of business investment. You can do quite a lot on property taxes in Scotland. I think that benefits Scotland as a whole, and whether that would sort of, you know, narrow or reduce inequalities, I'm not sure, but it would be a rising tide. I'm not sure kind of how much it would lift up the different boats there. I think when it comes to thinking about tax devolution to local areas, I would think about that as about empowering local areas in order to kind of, you know, make somewhat different decisions in terms of kind of, you know, their revenue mix, the amount they want to spend. I also think there's kind of a role here for local government, if you like, to share some of the burden, actually, that we're going to see over the next kind of 20, 30, 40 years of rising costs of many public services. At the moment, what we see in the UK is, because you have quite a centralised tax system, centralised in Westminster, and then within Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, centralised in the capital cities there and central governments there, actually, you know, given that many of the spending pressures are coming through local government on social care, on children's social services and so on, it kind of creates this relationship where local government has to kind of keep asking money for central government, and central government then faces all the political pressure to sort of raise that money. I actually think by having some more devolved tax powers to local areas, both in Scotland and actually elsewhere in the UK, it actually creates a sort of a more grown-up relationship where local government is more empowered and able to make more decisions and play more of a role itself, and actually kind of remove some of the burden for central government for being the one that everyone always goes in cap in hand to. I think when it comes to redistribution and kind of like levelling up, I think kind of the key role there is actually about equalisation. It's not really about kind of tax devolution. It's about making sure that alongside any tax devolution, or even in the current system, that you have a grant distribution system that is actually probably making sure money is going to those areas that have the greatest need for it. Scotland's done a better job than England in keeping its local government finance system up to date and responsive to changes in needs. But one factor underlying Scotland's system is that the system only accounts for 65% of the differences in areas' ability to raise council tax. So if you like, you're an area that has a relatively low tax base, you've got to make up a third of that difference yourself, either in lower public services or in terms of higher local taxes. If you want to think about making sure that those more deprived areas of Scotland do get the resources they need, maybe looking at that, what's called equalisation percentage, raising it up from 65% more, you know, to higher. Wales, for example, has 100% equalisation of council tax bases. That's one thing you could look at. That could sit alongside changes to council tax and tax devolution. But I think kind of, I would see tax devolution and tax reform is about productivity and fairness and empowerment. I would see the levelling up side of things being mainly about how that sits alongside how you allocate funding, the tools to redistribute around Scotland.
I think, thanks, David. Just to follow up, I'm not an expert in fiscal, but I think that what you've talked about, I think it's about the legitimacy of some of those tax decisions. And I think, David, when you talk about, I think it's an example from Glasgow. We've got the intelligence hub, so it's kind of understanding, drawing data, and understanding where those needs are, where that budget or grant might go, and what the benefits of that might be in terms of overall productivity. So it's not a tax question, it's how that money raised can be used. And another thing that's coming back from our members on the Scotland Forum is that, yes, there's a need for regulation, but that regulation is kind of developed in such a way that enables businesses to use their resources as best as they can. It's not a direct tax question, but I think it's related to how those monies might be used or thought through.
Yeah, I'd also echo what David said on the way I think about it. Mainly is the tax system being a driver of productivity in general. So, property taxation, business rates, LBTT, in particular being a hindrance to reallocation. So, the LBTT is a tax on transactions. So, it means that the people who are located in residential and non-residential buildings might not be the people that get the most value from them. And when we talk about companies, that's very closely tied to maximising productivity. So reducing the distortions created by that would be definitely productivity enhancing. And on business rates, it's if you invest in the structure of your business and improve its quality, improve its value, you are then taxed on that. So, we have proposed exempting new structures from business rates, and then over time it kind of becomes much more targeted on the value of the land, which you can't do much about, and so it's a kind of efficient tax from an economic perspective. So that could be something within Scotland's existing devolved tax powers that you could look at there. And then on the how does this fit with regional inequalities? Yeah, I think it's the devolution bit is the important bit, and it's about not just empowering local authorities to giving them the powers to do things, but also the incentives to improve their productivity in their local areas if they are retaining more of the tax receipts from higher property taxes or business rates, council tax. If there's a more direct link between what the local authorities can do to boost property values in their area, which often mean better amenities, better jobs, and the benefit they themselves gain from that can be a kind of tool for some of these reforms to take place.
Thank you, Convener.
Final question to the panel from myself. I said at the beginning, this session is very much part of the committee's scrutiny of NSET, and you've all touched on some aspects of NSET, but I'm just keen to get any final thoughts you have on, I suppose, what you think a good economic strategy is. Do you think, for example, the measures of success in NSET are the right ones? Are the promised actions focused on the right areas, or do you have any wider thoughts on NSET and crucially its implementation? A nice, short, easy one to end the session with.
I mean, I think, funnily enough, I looked at it, and you often take a critical take, but the work I'm doing closely with businesses and public sector, just in an anecdotal way, I could actually see that NSET is filtering through. And it's filtering through in quite creative ways. So I think it's got a nice balance. I think the challenge is to configure, to make sure it configures, and that you have that sort of joined up bit of where that will tip it over to productivity. But certainly from on the ground, I'm starting to see that trickle through.
I think on the regional dimension, I alluded to this before. One thing actually, I should start by saying I thought the NSET has a lot to commend. It's great, basically. We've done a lot of work.
Is that one of the challenges? It's got a lot because it does just about cover everything. I mean, should it be more focused, or should there be more prioritisation?
I think there are elements where this comes through of prioritisation, but maybe I think that doesn't come through really explicitly in terms of what are the key measures of success. So, you know, if you look at what the UK government is doing right now, they've got their 6 headline missions, and then for each of those missions, they've got 1 to 3, I think, key measures of success. Whereas I think in the NSET, there's more disparate measures of what success would look like. So a bit more focus on, you know, what are the key things we want to hit, and then just on this regional point, what does success look like for different regions? Is something that, you know, doesn't come through overly clearly. What's the kind of unit of analysis that we care about? Is it to the discussion earlier? Is it cities versus towns? Is it the areas around cities that we care about? And so, you know, a world in which there's perhaps more inequality within those areas. So the cities are doing very well, but that's where all the jobs are kind of agglomerating. Is that a successful outcome, or do we want more dispersion within those city regions? So yeah, I think that was the specific point I wanted to make around scale.
Thanks very much. Final word to David.
Yes, so again, I would sort of echo that. I think there is like lots to commend, and many of the issues that are kind of touched upon in the NSET are important. And I said I particularly was pleased to see kind of like management and sort of like skills management being kind of mentioned in there, which is often sort of, you know, said an unfashionable sort of topic. I think there's a couple of areas where it could be sort of built out upon. I think kind of, you touched upon this a little bit, I think some sense of both prioritization and phasing, kind of like how do these building blocks fit together? What needs to come first and what can kind of follow on? Because you need to sort of avoid, you know, chicken and egg type situations. And I think one of the things that actually can be a good place to kind of start your investment is in those things that are both valued by families and people and by businesses. So that could be kind of, you know, digital infrastructure, or it could be kind of like nice town centres and environments. I think schools actually is an important one, and that is missing in this. We know that families want to like live where there are good schools. We know businesses want to have, you know, the next generation of good workers. So I think kind of a bit more of a sense of like, you know, what are the kind of like initial steps and how does this kind of build on from each other? And I would also kind of echo a little bit about what Simon was saying there, a sense that, you know, if this is a strategy which has a sort of regional dimension, sort of what are the roles of different regions? And I said, I thought that actually was a strength of the former UK government's levelling up plan. It had quite a clear sense that we're not trying to level up everyone exactly the same way. There will be sort of, you know, what we want is we want to have another London or mini London in each region, rather than trying to spread our kind of, you know, spread things too widely across entire regions, so that, you know, if people do need to commute a little bit, or sometimes even move to get some of the very, very most sort of high-skilled jobs, they need to just move 50 miles rather than 300 miles across the country. I think that would be kind of like a big change for the UK as a whole, and probably for Scotland. So I think, yeah, that regional dimension. I think it's good that it kind of emphasises the role of, you know, local areas in developing their own plans, but that I think needs to kind of sit within a sort of a framework the Scottish Government also has in mind as well.
Okay. Thank you so much indeed for that, David, and thank you so much indeed to all our panel. That brings us to the end of the evidence session. I appreciate we probably kept you longer than we promised when we asked you to join us today, but that's because your insights have been incredibly helpful to us. So thank you so much indeed for that, and now we'll move into private session.
Okay.